Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. I got my cup of coffee, got my Bible, and doing our Eastside Bible reading for the week of September 20th through the 26th, 2020. Our reading this week brings us to the end of the book of Isaiah, the last three chapters. And these last three chapters, there's a lot going on, some of it highly messianic. Chapter 64 contains a beautiful prayer for God's mercy. In chapter 65, there's a final rebuke of God's people, and then there's a sort of a finale in chapter 66, and that's the chapter that really seems most highly messianic of the three that we're reading this week. In chapter 66, God reaffirms his majesty. He pronounces his love for the humble. He confirms his disdain for the disobedient. And then he encourages hope for the future. And it's the second half of the chapter that seems to speak of the Messiah and the work that Jesus would come to accomplish. As we go back to our historical reading in 2 Kings, it gives substance to the spiritual disaster that Isaiah had been talking about for so much of his book. Manasseh succeeded his father Hezekiah as king of Judah. You remember all the good reforms that we talked about previously that Hezekiah had enacted. Well, his son Manasseh has the twin distinction of being not only the longest reigning king in Judah, he reigned for 55 years, but also arguably the most wicked. He immediately sets to work undoing all the good that his father had done. He was an idolatrous, power-hungry, bloodthirsty king that plunged the nation into wickedness. When we read of his account of his life in 2 Chronicles chapter 33, though, we're surprised by the repentance that we see in Manasseh. Unfortunately, though, it didn't seem to have much effect on the people. Maybe there was too much bad that he had done and inflicted on the people for them to turn around and embrace God. He was succeeded by his son Ammon, who takes after the worst of his father. He continues in his father's sins and only serves 2 years on the throne before he's killed by his own servants. Ammon's son Josiah, only 8 years old at the time, takes the throne. And over time, he's presented with a book of the law, which apparently had been lost for some time. And as it's read to him, he immediately recognizes that they had been disobedient to God. And so he sets about, over a period of time, to bring reforms to God. He wrecks the idols of the land that the people had been sacrificing to. And he reestablishes the Passover, which seems to be a huge success. But one of the things that it tells us during his life is that God's judgment still looms on the horizon for Judah. And we wonder why, since Josiah seems to be doing so much good. Well, the account in 2 Chronicles chapter 34 seems to indicate that although Josiah's heart was in it, the people's were not. It seems that they were forced into worshiping God only after Josiah had completely destroyed their idols. This week's reading takes us also through the book of Nahum. And the prophecy of Nahum is largely projected towards or targeted towards the kingdom of Assyria. If you know anything about history, you know that they were a war machine. They marched and marched and conquered, and they did it through intense bloodshed. Well, the time had come, God says through Nahum, for their bloody war-induced dominance to finally be ended. And fittingly, the prophecy contains a war scene vividly produced that projects her demise. In our New Testament reading this week, in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, we see that Paul is encouraging the church to accept the now penitent sinner that he had denounced back in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. You remember in that chapter he had talked about the sin in verse 1 and then spent the rest of that section just castigating the congregation for not doing anything about it. Well, they finally did, apparently, and it seems that it had the desired effect. The sinner had repented, and now Paul pleads with them. He urges them to accept him back. In chapter 3, Paul reaffirms the spiritual nature of the new covenant. In chapter 4, he again has to defend his apostleship. In chapter 5, he reminds them of the importance of faith. And then in chapter 6, he pleads with them to separate themselves from sin and sinful people. And it seems that through all of this, the Corinthian church is still struggling with spirituality. They're still in a struggle for doing right. And of course, it could be a picture of almost any congregation at any time. We're human and we struggle. And Paul still pleads through the preserved word for us to choose what's right. Well, that's our reading this week. And I hope that you'll be back with us again next week for another episode of our Eastside Bible reading. God bless you.